About 8 years ago, my wife and I moved here to Vonore, Tennessee. I've had the wonderful experience. I've had a grandfather that taught me how to hunt and fish and to garden. He had a farm, lived with him quite a bit. And on September 22nd, 1955, my grandfather picked me up. I was 14 years old, and we went squirrel hunting in Indiana. About 6 o'clock we came back out to the car. We had shot a few squirrels and we were skinning them out. And I had heard a unusual sound. And I told my grandfather, I got to find out what that sound is. So I walked up the fence along the road, probably about 25 yards, and I came to a point where the sound was much louder. So I started to climb the fence to go into the woods and see if I could find out what was making the sound. When I got on top of the fence, I looked down to see where I was going to step down. And at the bottom of the fence, up against the fence post, was a newborn baby girl. She was wrapped in a towel. Her umbilical cord was coagulated to the towel. She was bleeding on one side where whoever put her there apparently reached her over the fence and she got caught on the barbed wire, and then they just dropped her into the weeds. I yelled to my grandfather and I reached over to pick her up. And my grandfather yelled at me and he says, "Dave, don't pick her up." He came over and we looked at her and we seen that we probably would do more harm to her by picking her up. So we quickly went and got help. The sheriff came out, a sheriff deputy, and the town marshal near the little town that we were hunting at. Town marshal from Boston, Indiana. He had some medical experience, and he picked her up, put her in his cruiser, and we all had a caravan going to the hospital with sirens and going and lights flashing. They took her into the emergency room, and we no longer could see her. Afterwards, after many times of inquiring, we couldn't find out any information on her. Picture came out of her on the newspaper 2 or 3 days later. A nurse was holding her and said that they were going to be putting into an adoption agency, or it wasn't real clear. We inquired again to see if we could see her, and they said no, everything was secret and hiding everything. They sealed her records. About a year later, I was in junior high school, and 2 nurses had come to the school. My teacher came up to me and said, "Dave, you got to go to the principal's office." And I thought I must be in some kind of trouble, and I went up to the principal's office. Well, the 2 nurses were there, and they had the little baby I found, who was named at that time Roseanne Wayne. She was wrapped in blankets, sound asleep. They handed her to me and said, "Dave, we brought her to you to see her for the last time. She's being adopted out next week, and we just wanted you to be able to say goodbye to her." Some years later, married my wife, Gail, and I had told Gail about the experience, and we started searching, and we've been searching for about 40 years. We had written the newspaper, we had written agencies throughout Indiana, and couldn't find out any information. The only thing we found out was the records were sealed. We'd contacted the sheriff that was on duty at that time, and my friends that I graduated high school with, they knew the story and they were trying to help me also. And one of the men's wives, my best friend, they were attending a reunion at Boston, Indiana, And at the reunion, someone spoke up and asked questions, says, has anybody ever heard what happened to the little girl that was found in the woods? My best friend's wife jumps up and she says, I know who found her. And so she found out that the son of the Boston mayor, or Boston constable, that took her to the hospital that night, he was the son of him. And so she gave me his phone number and address. We wrote him a letter. He responded back about 2 weeks later. He researched his father's records and couldn't find out any information. Then he referred me to a retired sheriff from Wayne County, Indiana. His name was John Cady. And he said, try writing John and see, maybe John can help you. So we wrote John Cady a letter in early December of last year. John called me promptly and said he's going to do what he can to put us together, the little girl and I, by Christmas. And I thought that would be a miracle. He would call me about every other day and tell me that what he'd run into, and he couldn't find out any information, and who he'd talked to. And he kept researching, and then finally on Saturday morning before Christmas, he called me and he said, Dave, write down the name Mary Ellen Suey and this phone number. And I said, well, who is that? And he said, Dave, that's your little girl. I called her on the phone, heard her voice, and I couldn't talk to her. My emotions took over. I put my wife on the phone. She talked to her for a while, and I finally gathered myself together, and I talked to her on the phone. And ever since, we've been writing letters to each other, talking on the telephone, and sending emails to each other. And we've become very good friends. She lives in Riverside, California. And May 4th, we're having a reunion for the first time that we'll meet in person in Richmond, Indiana. And we're looking forward to it very, very much.